Map. I warned a fake HOA patrol to leave my land, but they refused and challenged the wrong owner. They never expected my hidden property records to expose their entire operation. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first thing I noticed was the fake badge, not the people wearing it. I was standing beside the old stone marker at the edge of my property when the sound of an unfamiliar engine broke the quiet morning. The gravel driveway that had been empty for years suddenly filled with the slow approach of a black SUV. The tires crushed the small stones beneath them, the engine hummed loudly, and for a moment, I thought someone had taken a wrong turn. Then I saw the logo on the door, HOA Community Patrol. I remember looking at it twice because something about it felt wrong. My name is Nathan Caldwell, and this land has been in my family for more than 3 decades. I know every corner of this property. I know the trees along the eastern fence line, the old barn behind the house, and every boundary marker that separates my land from the surrounding neighborhood. I also know one important thing. I have never belonged to their HOA. The SUV stopped near my gate, and 3 people stepped out. The woman in front walked toward me with a folder under her arm and the kind of confidence people have when they believe nobody will question them. "My name is Rebecca Thornton," she said. "I'm with the Neighborhood Compliance Patrol." I looked at the uniform. Then I looked at the vehicle. Then I looked back at her. "I don't have a Neighborhood Compliance Patrol." Her smile remained perfectly calm. "That's because you haven't been following the community requirements." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Rebecca opened the folder and pulled out a printed notice. "This property has several violations that need immediate attention." She handed me the paper. The language sounded official. The formatting looked professional. To someone who didn't know better, it might have been convincing. But I noticed small details. The wrong property reference. The missing authorization information. The vague wording. It was the kind of document designed to create fear before anyone had time to ask questions. "What exactly gives you authority over this land?" I asked. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "The community has established standards." That wasn't my question. The 2 people standing behind her became quiet. The wind moved across the field beside us, carrying the smell of fresh grass and the distant sound of birds from the tree line. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Rebecca stepped closer. "Mr. Caldwell, we are trying to help you avoid unnecessary problems." I looked at the notice in my hand. "No, you're trying to create problems and convince me they already exist." Her expression changed. Only for a second, but I saw it. The confidence disappeared before she quickly replaced it. "You may want to reconsider your attitude." That sentence told me exactly who I was dealing with. People who have real authority don't need to threaten you with it. They explain it. They prove it. They don't simply expect obedience. I folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "You need to leave my property." Rebecca stared at me. "You're refusing a direct compliance request?" "I'm refusing something you have no right to demand." She looked around at the land behind me. The barn. The fields. The fence my grandfather built before this neighborhood existed. She saw empty space. I saw decades of ownership. Before she turned away, Rebecca gave me one final look. "You're making a mistake." I watched the SUV disappear down the driveway, leaving only tire marks in the gravel. At that moment, I didn't know how far this would go. I didn't know how many people she had already pressured. And I didn't know that the documents she carried would eventually become the reason everything she built started falling apart. But I knew one thing. Rebecca Thornton believed she had found an easy target. She had no idea she had just picked the wrong landowner. The warning signs were everywhere, but most people only noticed them after the damage is done. The morning after Rebecca Thornton drove away from my property, I expected the situation to end. I was wrong. I woke up before sunrise, as I usually did, and stepped outside with a cup of coffee in my hand. The air was cool, the ground was still wet from the overnight rain, and the only sounds came from the birds in the trees and the wind moving through the fields. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then I saw the paper attached to my gate. A violation notice. I walked closer and immediately recognized the logo. The same fake HOA patrol. The same people who had stood on my property the day before now believed they could leave orders behind as if they had authority. I removed the paper carefully and read every line. They claimed my fence violated neighborhood standards. They claimed my storage building needed approval. They claimed my property was subject to community regulations. The problem was simple. None of it was true. My fence was older than the neighborhood surrounding me. The storage building had been on my land for years, and the community they represented had never owned a single inch of my property. I folded the notice and placed it on my workbench. That was when I stopped wondering if Rebecca simply made a mistake. She knew exactly what she was doing. Over the next several days, the patrol vehicle became a familiar sight. It would slowly pass my driveway in the afternoon. Sometimes it would stop near the road. Sometimes someone inside would take pictures toward my property. They never crossed the boundary again. They didn't need to. They wanted me to feel watched. They wanted me to believe they were always one step away. But intimidation only works when the person being intimidated believes the other side has real power. And I didn't. My name is Nathan Caldwell. I spent years studying property boundaries and land records because my work depended on knowing exactly where ownership began and ended. Numbers don't care about confidence. Maps don't care about titles. Documents don't care how important someone thinks they are. That night, I went into my office and started looking through old records. The room was quiet except for the sound of papers moving across the desk. I opened folders that had been untouched for years. Property deeds, tax documents, survey reports, everything connected to my land. I wasn't searching for a way to fight Rebecca. I was searching for the truth. Around midnight, I found the first inconsistency. The document she gave me referenced a community boundary that didn't match the official property records. I checked it again, then again. The mistake wasn't small. It was deliberate. Someone had taken general HOA information and made it look like it applied to my property. The next morning, my neighbor, Thomas Reed, stopped by. They left one of those notices at my house too, he said. I looked at him. What did they claim? He sighed. They said my driveway didn't meet community appearance standards. I looked toward the road where the patrol vehicle had been parked before. That was when I realized something important. I wasn't the only person they were testing. Rebecca wasn't protecting a neighborhood. She was seeing how many people would accept her authority without asking questions. And that was her biggest mistake. Because questions lead to records. Records lead to proof. And proof has a way of destroying anything built on a lie. Rebecca Thornton thought she had started a compliance campaign. She didn't realize she had started creating the evidence that would eventually bring everything down. The old survey map was buried under years of dust, but it contained the one thing Rebecca Thornton never expected me to find. I sat alone in my office that night, surrounded by stacks of property records and faded documents that carried the history of my land. The only light came from the desk lamp above me. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the house made the familiar sounds it had made for decades. The same sounds I had grown up with. The same sounds that reminded me this property was more than just a piece of land. It was my family's legacy. I placed Rebecca's violation notice beside my old records and started comparing every detail. The first thing I checked was the boundary description. It was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Completely wrong. The document they gave me showed my property as if it existed inside the HOA-controlled area. But my official records told a different story. My land had been established long before that neighborhood was built. The HOA had rules for their residents. They had meetings. They had community guidelines. But they had never owned my property. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the papers spread across the desk. That was when I understood Rebecca's strategy. She wasn't trying to prove she had authority. She was trying to make people believe she had authority. There was a big difference. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The building smelled like old paper and polished wood. The sound of printers running in the background mixed with quiet conversations from people searching for their own answers. I requested every public document connected to my property. Deeds, surveys, boundary adjustments, historical records. After waiting nearly an hour, the clerk returned with a large folder. "This is everything connected to this parcel," she said. I thanked her and carried it to a nearby table. Inside was the document I had been hoping to find. An original property survey from decades earlier. I unfolded the large map carefully. The lines were faded, but they were clear. My property boundary stopped exactly where it always had. The neighborhood boundary stopped somewhere else entirely. There was no confusion, no gray area, no misunderstanding. Rebecca's patrol had been acting like they controlled land that was never theirs. I took photos of every page and saved copies of the records. But I didn't rush back to confront her. That would have been the mistake she expected. People like Rebecca prepared for arguments. They prepared for anger. They prepared for emotional reactions. What they rarely prepared for was patience. I wanted to know how far this went. So I started asking questions. I spoke with more neighbors. One homeowner showed me a warning letter about his driveway. Another showed me a notice demanding changes to his front yard. A third person told me Rebecca's patrol had threatened additional penalties if residents refused to cooperate. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about keeping a neighborhood organized. This was about control. Rebecca had created an image of authority and relied on people being too intimidated to challenge it. But every notice she delivered created another piece of evidence. Every warning she issued created another record. Every person she pressured created another witness. By the end of the week, I had a folder sitting on my desk. Not just my documents. Not just my proof. A collection of everything they had done. I looked at the stack and realized something important. Rebecca thought she was building a case against us. She was actually building one against herself. And she still had no idea that the quiet landowner she tried to push around had already started putting the pieces together. The moment Rebecca Thornton stepped onto my property again, I knew she wasn't there to discuss anything. She was there because she still believed she was in control. 3 days after discovering the original survey records, I was standing near my mailbox when I saw the same black SUV turning onto my driveway. The engine slowed. The tires moved over the gravel. And just like the first time, that vehicle carried the same confidence of someone who believed nobody would stop them. Rebecca stepped out alone this time. No patrol members. No witnesses. Just her, a folder, and the same expression she wore when she first told me my own land had rules I had to follow. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, walking closer. "I think we need to resolve this situation before it becomes more complicated." I looked at the folder in her hand. "I agree. It would be easier if you stopped sending notices for property you don't control." Her smile tightened. That was the first sign that things were different. Before, Rebecca believed I was confused. Now, she knew I was paying attention. She opened the folder and removed another document. "This is a final compliance agreement. Signing it will prevent further action." I took the paper but didn't sign. I read every line carefully. The same vague language. The same missing details. The same attempt to create authority without actually proving it. Rebecca watched me silently. "You understand this could affect your standing in the community." I looked up. My standing in a community I'm not part of? For the first time, she didn't answer immediately. That pause told me more than any document could. People who know they are right usually explain. People who know they are losing control usually hesitate. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation," she finally said. "No," I replied. "I think I understand it better than you expected." I reached into my truck and pulled out a copy of the original property survey. I placed it between us. The wind moved across the field, lifting the corner of the paper slightly. Rebecca looked down. At first, she seemed uninterested. Then her eyes stopped moving. She saw the boundary lines. She saw the dates. She saw the official markings showing exactly where my property ended and where the HOA area began. Her expression changed. It was subtle, but it was there. The confidence disappeared. "What is this?" she asked. "The truth." She picked up the document and studied it longer. "This doesn't change anything." But her voice was different. Less certain. More defensive. "It changes everything," I said. "You have been issuing violations against land that has never been under your authority." Rebecca looked away toward the road. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the birds in the trees and the distant sound of a lawn mower from another property. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. The kind of sounds that disappear when people start believing they have the right to control others. Finally, Rebecca handed the survey back. "You should be careful, Mr. Caldwell. Challenging the HOA can create unnecessary attention." I almost smiled, because that sentence confirmed everything. She wasn't defending rules. She was defending control. After she left, I stood there holding the survey in my hand and watched her SUV disappear. But this time felt different. The first visit was a threat. The second visit was a mistake. Rebecca came back expecting to pressure me into surrendering. Instead, she revealed something much more important. She was not prepared for someone who kept records. She was not prepared for someone who understood boundaries. And she definitely was not prepared for someone who refused to be intimidated. What Rebecca didn't know was that the survey was only the beginning. Because while she was focused on forcing me to obey, I had already started uncovering how many other people she had tried to control. The first time I met my neighbors after discovering the truth, I realized Rebecca Thornton's biggest mistake was believing everyone was too afraid to speak. For years, people around me had accepted the HOA patrol's warnings without question. Not because they agreed, because they didn't want trouble. And I understood that. Most people don't wake up wanting a fight with someone who carries a clipboard, wears a uniform, and speaks with confidence. When someone acts like they have authority, many people assume they probably do. That was exactly what Rebecca was counting on. A few days after my second meeting with her, I invited several neighbors over to my property. The afternoon was quiet. The sun was low over the fields, and the wooden fence stretched across the land like it had for decades. I placed my folder on the table outside. Inside were copies of everything. The fake violation notices, the property records, the original survey, the documents that proved the truth. Thomas Reed was the first to arrive. He looked at the stack of papers and shook his head. I knew something felt wrong, he said, but I didn't know where to start. That sentence stayed with me, because I realized Rebecca's strategy depended on confusion. She didn't need everyone to believe her forever. She only needed them to doubt themselves long enough to obey. One by one, more neighbors arrived. They brought their own stories. A warning about a driveway. A demand to remove decorations. A notice claiming a homeowner needed permission for changes on their own property. Different situations. Same pattern. Rebecca Thornton had been testing boundaries. Not just physical boundaries. Human ones. She wanted to know how far she could push before someone pushed back. I opened the original survey and placed it in the center of the table. This is where my property begins and ends, I explained. Then I showed them the documents connected to the HOA. This is where their authority actually stops. Everyone became quiet. The difference was obvious. There was no misunderstanding. No complicated legal argument. Just facts. One neighbor, Sarah Mitchell, looked through the notices she had received. They never showed us anything like this, she said. They didn't want you to see it, I replied. That was the moment the mood changed. People who had been nervous started asking questions. People who had stayed silent started comparing documents. The fear that Rebecca had built began disappearing. And in its place came something much more dangerous for her. Awareness. Later that evening, I organized everything into a timeline. Dates, names, locations, every interaction, every notice, every claim. I wasn't trying to attack Rebecca. I was documenting what happened. There is a difference. Emotions disappear. Records remain. The next morning, I received a message from another homeowner who had never spoken to me before. He said he had been afraid to challenge the patrol because he thought he was alone. Now he wanted to share his experience. That was when I knew this was bigger than my property. Rebecca had created a system based on people staying quiet. But silence only protects unfairness until someone decides to break it. And once that happened, everything started changing. The same people who once lowered their voices when Rebecca walked by were now comparing records and asking for answers. She wanted a neighborhood that followed without question. Instead, she created a neighborhood that started looking for the truth. And the truth was something she could not control. Because Rebecca Thornton didn't realize she wasn't fighting one homeowner anymore. She was facing an entire community that had finally learned to ask one simple question. Where is the proof? The room was silent when Rebecca Thornton realized she was no longer speaking to one homeowner. She was standing in front of a community that had finally learned the truth. The HOA meeting started on a cold Thursday evening. I remember walking into the community center and feeling the tension before anyone said a word. The room was filled with neighbors who had spent weeks staying quiet. Some sat with folded arms. Some held copies of their notices. Some simply watched, waiting to see what would happen. At the front of the room, Rebecca Thornton stood beside a table covered with folders and paperwork. She looked exactly like she did the first day she arrived at my property. Confident, prepared, certain that everyone would listen. But this time, something was different. People were no longer looking at her with uncertainty. They were looking at her with questions. Rebecca started the meeting by explaining that the patrol program was created to protect community standards. Those words sounded familiar. Too familiar. I watched as she described the notices, the inspections, and the supposed violations as if everything had been done properly. Then she displayed a document on the screen behind her. "This agreement confirms our authority," she said. A few people nodded. Not because they believed her, because they were waiting for the moment someone finally challenged the story. I stood up from my chair. The room became quiet. "Rebecca, can I ask one question?" She looked at me. For a second, I saw the same confidence from the driveway. The same expression she had when she thought I would simply accept her demands. "Of course," she said. I walked toward the front table with my folder in my hand. "Can you explain why your patrol issued violations on properties that are outside HOA boundaries?" The room changed instantly. People started looking at each other. Rebecca remained still. "I think there is some confusion about property classifications," she replied. I opened the folder. I thought so too. That's why I checked the official records. I placed the original survey on the table. The paper landed softly, but the reaction was louder than any argument could have been. Several neighbors moved closer. Rebecca looked down at the document. Then she looked back at me. "This does not prove anything." I turned the page. "It proves the boundary. It proves ownership. And it proves your patrol was operating beyond its authority." The room became completely silent. Then Thomas Reed stood up. "She gave me a violation notice for my driveway," he said. Another neighbor spoke. "She told me I needed permission for changes on my own property." Another voice followed. "And she threatened additional penalties if I ignored her." One by one, the stories came out. The same pattern, the same pressure, the same assumption that nobody would challenge her. Rebecca tried to interrupt. "These situations are being misunderstood." But the problem was that misunderstanding requires missing information. And now everyone had the information. The documents were there. The records were there. The witnesses were there. I watched Rebecca's confidence slowly disappear. Not because someone defeated her in an argument. Because facts don't need to argue. They simply exist. After the meeting, several neighbors stayed behind. They compared notices. They shared dates. They documented everything. The same people who once avoided conflict were now creating a record of what happened. As I packed my folder, I looked back at the empty chairs and thought about how quickly things changed. Rebecca came in believing a uniform and a vehicle were enough to create authority. She believed people would obey because they were afraid of consequences. But she forgot something important. Fear only works when nobody knows the truth. And now the truth was sitting in that room with all of us. The next step was no longer about proving my property was mine. That part was already done. The next step was finding out how far Rebecca's fake authority had reached. Because the more records we collected, the clearer one thing became. Rebecca Thornton wasn't protecting a community. She was building a case against herself. The evidence was no longer hidden inside my folder. It was spreading through the community, and Rebecca Thornton was about to discover that every person she pressured had become part of the truth she could not escape. After the HOA meeting, everything moved faster. The same people who once avoided discussing Rebecca's patrol started reaching out. Messages came in. Phone calls followed. Neighbors who had stayed silent for months were finally ready to share what happened. I spent the next several days organizing everything in my office. The room looked different than it had before. The first time I opened my records, I was searching for proof that Rebecca had no authority over my property. Now, my desk was covered with evidence showing how many people had been affected. Every notice had a date. Every complaint had a name. Every interaction had a pattern. I created a timeline. Not because I wanted revenge, because facts need structure. Without organization, even the truth can become difficult to prove. With everything arranged, the picture became clearer. Rebecca's patrol had followed the same method every time. First, they appeared professional. Then, they claimed authority. After that, they created pressure. And finally, they waited for people to give in. The strategy depended on one thing. Nobody asking for proof. But now everyone was asking. One afternoon, I met with Sarah Mitchell at her home. She showed me the first notice she received from Rebecca's patrol. The paper looked official. The language sounded serious. But when we compared it with the actual HOA documents, the problems became obvious. They wanted me to believe I had no choice, Sarah said. I looked at the notice again. That's exactly how this worked. She folded the paper carefully. I wish I had questioned it sooner. I understood that feeling. Because people often blame themselves after realizing they were misled. But the responsibility belonged to the person creating the deception, not the people who trusted the appearance of authority. Over the next week, more residents provided statements. Some had photographs. Some had copies of messages. Some had records of conversations with Rebecca's patrol members. Each piece added another layer. The operation that once looked organized was starting to look fragile. Because real authority leaves a trail of accountability. Fake authority leaves a trail of mistakes. I decided it was time to submit everything. I prepared a complete package. Property records, survey documents, resident statements, copies of every notice. Everything was arranged clearly. When I placed the final document into the folder, I remembered the first paper Rebecca handed me. The violation notice. At the time, she believed it was a warning. She believed it would make me step back. Instead, it became the first piece of evidence. The same document meant to intimidate me became the beginning of the case against her. I delivered the records to the appropriate local office and waited. Waiting was never easy, but I had learned something important throughout this process. Rushing creates mistakes. Patience creates opportunities. A few days later, Rebecca contacted me. She wanted another meeting. Her message was polite, but I could read between the words. She knew something had changed. When we met, she looked different. The confidence was still there, but it was weaker. "You're making this much bigger than it needs to be," she said. I looked at her calmly. "I didn't make it bigger. Your actions did." She looked away. For the first time, Rebecca had no prepared answer. Because the conversation was no longer about opinions. It was about records. It was about evidence. It was about accountability. Before leaving, she said one final thing. "You really think this is going to change anything?" I looked at the folder sitting between us. Yes. Because she still believed power came from convincing people to obey. She still didn't understand. The moment people started documenting the truth was the moment her authority started disappearing. And she had created every piece of evidence herself. The envelope sitting on my desk looked ordinary, but inside it was the decision that would determine whether Rebecca Thornton's fake authority survived or collapsed forever. I remember the morning clearly. The sunlight was coming through the kitchen window. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and for the first time in weeks, my property felt peaceful again. Then I saw the envelope. No dramatic warning. No aggressive message. Just a simple piece of mail sitting quietly among the usual paperwork. But I knew exactly what it was. The response we had been waiting for. I carried it to my office and placed it on the desk beside the folder that started everything. The same folder that once held a single violation notice. Now it contained weeks of evidence. Property records. Resident statements. Copies of unauthorized demands. A complete timeline of Rebecca Thornton's actions. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was confirmation that the complaints and documentation had been reviewed. The records were clear. The patrol had no authority over properties outside the HOA boundaries. The notices issued against those homeowners had no legal foundation. The claims they made had been unsupported. For a moment, I just sat there. Not because I was surprised. Because after everything that happened, seeing the truth officially recognized felt different. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about proving that confidence and authority are not the same thing. Rebecca had spent weeks acting like a uniform, and a vehicle gave her power. But real power comes from facts. And facts had finally caught up with her. Later that afternoon, I walked outside and stood near the same gate where Rebecca first handed me that fake violation notice. The gravel beneath my boots was still marked by the same driveway where her SUV had stopped. The fence was still standing. The old stone marker was still in place. Nothing about my property had changed. Only the story around it had. A few days later, Rebecca requested another meeting. This time, she didn't arrive with the same confidence. No folder filled with threats. No speech about compliance. Just a quiet conversation. "I think things have gone too far," she said. I looked at her. "Things went too far when you started enforcing rules you had no right to enforce." She looked down. For once, she didn't have an answer ready. "I was trying to maintain order," she said. I shook my head. Order requires fairness. Control requires fear. The silence that followed said everything. Rebecca had built her entire approach around people believing she couldn't be challenged. But once people questioned her claims, the foundation disappeared. She had underestimated the importance of documentation. She had underestimated the patience of homeowners. And most importantly, she had underestimated the value of simply asking for proof. Before leaving, she looked toward my property. I never expected this to happen. I almost believed her. Because people who misuse authority often believe they are protected by the appearance of legitimacy. They forget that appearances eventually meet reality. After she left, I returned to my office and placed the final document into the folder. The first notice she gave me was still there. I kept it, not as a reminder of anger, as a reminder of the moment everything changed. That piece of paper was supposed to make me surrender. Instead, it became the reason the truth came out. Rebecca thought she had found a quiet landowner who would simply comply. She found someone who kept records. She found someone who knew his rights. And she found a community that was tired of being told to stay silent. The fake HOA patrol that arrived with confidence left behind something completely different. A lesson. Authority without truth does not last. Because eventually, someone asks the question that changes everything. Where is the proof? The final lesson Rebecca Thornton learned was not written in a document or spoken during a meeting. It was written by the people who finally refused to stay silent. Months after the fake HOA patrol first arrived at my gate, I stood outside my property watching the morning sunlight spread across the fields. The same fields Rebecca tried to control. The same fence she claimed needed approval. The same land she believed she could intimidate me into surrendering. But everything looked exactly the same. The only thing that changed was the understanding of everyone who lived around me. When this started, I was just trying to protect my property. I wanted to make one thing clear. My land was mine. My records were accurate. And nobody had the right to pretend otherwise. But somewhere along the way, this became bigger than my own situation. It became about every homeowner who received a notice and wondered if they were wrong. Every person who stayed quiet because they didn't want conflict. Every neighbor who believed challenging someone with confidence was impossible. Rebecca's mistake was thinking people were powerless. She confused silence with agreement. She confused patience with weakness. And she confused a lack of confrontation with a lack of courage. After the official review confirmed what we already knew, the fake patrol disappeared from the neighborhood. The black SUV stopped driving past houses. The warning notices stopped appearing. The pressure stopped. But the lesson remained. People began keeping copies of important documents. They started asking questions. They started checking facts before accepting demands. That was the real change. Not a victory speech. Not a dramatic moment. A community simply became harder to manipulate. I kept the original violation notice Rebecca gave me. It still sits in the same folder with the property survey and all the records. Some people ask me why I saved it. The answer is simple. Because that piece of paper represents the moment everything changed. It was supposed to scare me. Instead, it reminded me to look closer. It reminded me that authority must be proven. And it reminded me that the truth does not need to be loud. It only needs to be supported. Looking back, the most surprising part was not that Rebecca was wrong. The most surprising part was how long nobody questioned her. She built her confidence on assumptions. She relied on appearances. She believed a uniform, a vehicle, and a serious tone were enough to make people surrender. But those things are temporary. Documents remain. Records remain. Evidence remains. And eventually, the truth catches up. The last time I saw Rebecca, she didn't threaten me. She didn't mention compliance. She simply looked across my property and said, "I never expected this." I believed her. Because people who misuse authority often don't realize how fragile it is until someone finally challenges it. Rebecca came looking for an easy target. She found a landowner who knew his rights. She found neighbors who wanted answers. And she found a community that understood one important lesson. Respect cannot be demanded through fear. Trust cannot be created through intimidation. And real authority can never be built on something false. Today, when I stand at that same gate, I don't think about the conflict. I think about what happened after. A group of people who learned to question. A community that learned to protect itself. And a reminder that justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly. With a document. A question. A person willing to stand their ground. Because in the end, Rebecca Thornton didn't lose because I fought harder. She lost because the truth was always stronger than the story she created.